Great.
Okay, cool. So yeah, just a big welcome again to everyone who's online. It's so nice to see all of your wonderful faces and hear your voices. And yeah, big welcome to Kavi, or Jacobus, if you would like to call him that instead. So I'll just tell you a little bit about him, and then yeah, we'll get into the talk. I'm really excited for our astrology topic. So Kavi-karnapura Das has been an avid student of Vedic astrology since 2002. His encounter with books on Chinese astrology and the Bhagavad Purana, coupled with his own interest for a meditative path, led him to being a monk for 14 years. Wow, that's just incredible. During this time, he was fortunate enough to spend 4 years in India for a higher studying Sanskrit and Vaishnava theology, going on pilgrimage and meeting some remarkable spiritual practitioners. He's currently based in Germany, completing a master's in Indology at the University of Hamburg with a focus on early Buddhist astrology. Cool. So yeah, I'll just hand over to Kavi Prabhu, and he'll go through the talk for us. And just yeah, if anyone has questions during the talk, please can you use the raise hand function of Zoom? So you just click on participants at the bottom of your screen, and then you will be able to raise your hand, and then you can ask your question, and Kavi will take it. Cool. Thanks so much.
And Tara, if I miss any questions, please point them out.
Right. Sure thing, I'll do that.
Okay, so I wasn't exactly sure what format the evening will take, but the request is that we discuss the astrology of 2020, a year that has turned out to be remarkable in many ways, and as I think not cease to surprise us. Definitely it hasn't ceased to surprise me. Now, a good place to begin perhaps is just to consider the role of astrology in perhaps in bygone ages, because when we hear about the very idea of astrology, it may strike us as something outmoded for the day and age we live in. But for many, many centuries, astrology was held in very high regard. So much so that it really was part of any well-rounded education in the ancient world, even if you didn't completely agree with it. And of course, this is not to say that it was universally accepted and there was no protest against astrology and the implications thereof, but by and large, it has been an incredibly influential part of the ancient world, and we see its references almost everywhere, from ancient theology to ancient philosophy, statecraft. Everyone who was anyone would be in some way interested in how the sky influences the terrestrial world. The idea was that the sky and what is above is more perfect than that is what is below, and that fate trickled down, so to speak, from above to below. And there's that famous hermetic slogan, as above, so below. And this really points to the idea of interconnectedness. And that is an idea that we find very deeply explored in the spiritual traditions from India, beginning with the Vedas. These ancient texts and the hymns contained in them draw on a world view that is very much one of interconnectedness, where every single part of creation is seen as a fractal, so to speak, of all other parts of creation. And there are many very beautiful hints to this effect, even later in the Upanishads, like the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. And these texts, the Upanishads, are of course more philosophical than the Vedic hymns themselves. But in the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, we find the whole universe described in the form of a horse. Well worth checking out. But the idea is just that there was this understanding that all parts of existence are connected, and really that is how astrology should be approached. Not necessarily that the planets are in some way beaming an invisible force down on us and controlling us in some ways. Of course, if you page through the pages of history, you will find thinkers who have proposed exactly that, but you will also find others who maintained that the planets, or you could even say celestial phenomena in general, are simply the hands, so to speak, on a cosmic clock face. So we know that the hands on a clock don't move time along, they just measure it. And in a similar way, what we see in the sky is really a measuring out, or an indication of certain forces, certain qualitative forces, or to be perhaps even more metaphysical, certain aspects of consciousness. Through the centuries, these movements have been observed, and there's been a tremendous amount of research on this topic, because there was this very intimate understanding of how things are interconnected. And some of these major celestial happenings are of course also playing out right now, and that shouldn't surprise us at all, because it has been such an eventful year, a dramatic year in many ways. And if that was not reflected in the skies in some way, then we would have serious reason to question astrology. But now, instead, we see that there is exactly these very dramatic occurrences, and they have been playing out over the last year or so. And of course, if you look around on the internet, you will indeed find astrologers who have been hotly debating what will exactly happen in 2020, and well, already in 2019, because of these dramatic conjunctions of sorts. So I want to perhaps just briefly touch on the power of eclipses to begin with, and that is very appropriate because we are a day away from a lunar eclipse coming to us soon, on the full moon tomorrow, and you can think of lunar eclipses as bringing dramatic changes. They usually bring the result of factors that have been building up over time. A solar eclipse initiates suddenly and dramatically a new turn of events, while a lunar eclipse, broadly speaking, brings something to an end or brings something to a close, gives a payoff, so to speak. So we're heading for such a payoff, and perhaps if I describe some of the qualities of this eclipse, then you can think for yourself about what you've been hearing in the media and what has been playing out in the news. So we have this lunar eclipse in Sagittarius. Now, Sagittarius is the sign of preachers and philosophers and justice. It's ruled by Jupiter, the graha, or the planet, astrologically speaking, of justice. But Jupiter right now is in a position, traditionally, especially in Vedic astrology and ancient Indian astrology, understood to debilitate Jupiter. So Jupiter isn't able to give the grace and faith that he usually gives. And this then ties into a theme, a major theme for 2020. And that is Jupiter's debilitation, the fact that Jupiter is debilitated this year, meaning that it isn't functioning in its capacity to represent, you could say, growth, abundance, buoyancy, all of these positive qualities usually associated with Jupiter. So that is, so simply looking at Jupiter's position this year, we could have already expected at least some kind of a recession of sorts. No prizes for guessing when the last time was when Jupiter was debilitated. That was around 2008 with the financial crisis of that time. But to return to the eclipse that we are about to experience, it will take place in the sign of Sagittarius. Jupiter is debilitated, and additionally, Jupiter is with Pluto. And we will say quite a few things about Pluto because he is playing such a significant role this year. But Pluto has a very fiery, volcanic, destructive energy to it, and that lack of mercy, one can read Jupiter's debilitation this year like a lack of grace in the sense of mercy, or in other words, then harshness, combined with this very fiery but ultimately transformative energy of Pluto, is definitely part and parcel of what we're seeing right now around the world. Of course, it seems to me to tie in very well with the protests that have been sparked in the US. In fact, what is very interesting is there is such a thing as the so-called Saros cycle. So this has been studied for thousands of years, and if you're interested, there's definitely a lot written on this topic. Originally, the ancient Greeks observed that there are patterns in these eclipses. So I found it fascinating that the last eclipse with a similar pattern than the one we're experiencing tomorrow took place in 1966, and that was also a year of specifically it also took place in July, in fact, and this was a time of rioting in Chicago. Also race-related Chicago riots, also triggered to some degree by police brutality. You can read up about the history, but yeah, a major event, a lot of arrests, a lot of unrest because of that. So it's just fascinating to see how history in some ways repeat itself thematically, and this is then what we can rather easily see, astrologically speaking. I have to say, I've spent most of my time or most of my astrology studies more on the spiritual and the personality profiling side of things. But recently I have been paying much more attention to so-called mundane astrology, or political astrology, or the astrology of world events. And this particular Saros cycle is striking in that once again we've got race-related rioting, the idea of justice connected to Jupiter, but to what we have to add to this discussion then is that this eclipse that we're experiencing now, and it has been building for the last 2 weeks, at least in terms of the astrology of this eclipse. So the conditions are much more unstable, much more volatile than they were in the skies of 1966. We have a very volatile situation to work with this year, in other words. So yeah, I find that interesting and also slightly alarming then. I hope that things will not, of course, get too far out of hand. At the same time, there is a great deal of volatility in the air, astrologically speaking. And for that, then I want to maybe shift the focus to the actual year chart for 2020. So there's a very old tradition going back to the Persians of drawing up a chart for the year at the very moment that the sun enters the sign of Aries. And there are many good reasons for choosing that date, but it's understood that the sun's entrance into Aries denotes the beginning of the astrological year. It's the beginning of spring in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's perhaps then not surprising that 2020 has some extreme influences in terms of the planetary placements of this chart. To begin with, as we've already mentioned, we have Jupiter, the planet of grace, of mercy, of compassion, of faith, under a lot of strain, debilitated. And very close to Jupiter, we already have Pluto as well, this energy of deep transformation. And then we also have, of course, Saturn, very close to Jupiter, and we have Mars. Now, all four of these planets mentioned, all four of them at the beginning of this astrological year, they were in the sign of Capricorn. And Capricorn is the sign of authority, of power, the powers that be. It's a sign of the rulers, and maybe more specifically, the systems that enable power to control the masses. So we have obviously been seeing, on one hand, a lot of hard-handed dealings in this regard, governments all around the world coming down very strongly, sometimes a little bit late, but depending on your perspective, but coming down very strongly on the population in general because of this COVID crisis. And we will get to the COVID crisis as well, and the astrology of its outbreak, which again has some fascinating resonance with earlier pandemics, specifically the Justinian plague of the year 540 or so, which has almost exactly the same astrology as 2019, 2020. But to return to 2020, we can expect then a general pattern of a loss of faith, Jupiter debilitated, in our power structures, the system breaking down. Why would the system be breaking down? The system would be breaking down because of the very destructive influence of Pluto. Pluto, of course, in the Western tradition is associated with the underworld, and has a bit of an ominous atmosphere connected to it. Similarly, in the Vedic tradition, Pluto seems to have a connection to Lord Shiva, the cosmic destroyer. So initially, some years ago, when I discussed some of these configurations with other astrologers, we were all um, troubled, to say the least, and immediately started speculating about what exactly is going to go down at the end of 2019, beginning 2020. There is an old tradition that Jupiter has a connection to the Middle East and to the Middle Eastern the people, the races of the Middle East. So there was speculation that trouble will start in the Middle East. And at the beginning of the year, or some time ago, when Qasem Soleimani was assassinated by the United States military, this Iranian general, it almost felt like this could be the spark that sets things off. And we will, well, we have to at some point and also mention the theme of assassinations when dealing with Saturn, Pluto conjunctions, and this is exactly what we're seeing this year. You see, these Saturn and Pluto joined in the sign of Capricorn already at the beginning of this year, around the 12th of January, and this this conjunction itself is also really intense. Okay, so if I imagine that if you haven't read or studied that much about astrology and you're listening to this, you will start to form the picture in your mind that yes, this is this intense thing and this intense thing and this intense thing, and all of them are converging on 2020. And if that image is emerging in your mind, in your imagination, then that indeed is true, because it is a collection of extraordinary conjunctions that do justice to what we've seen around us playing out. So this Saturn-Pluto conjunction then that really sets the tone for 2020, and I would include the end of 2019 to this period. In fact, around the 22nd of December last year, this conjunction was close enough to have an impact. So what do we mean by conjunction here? This is perhaps an important term to understand. So when you have two planetary bodies, two planets seemingly coming together in terms of our perspective from Earth, we see in that a convergence of archetypes, a convergence of themes. Okay, so we have the theme of Saturn then, and Saturn gives us structure, as we've said, the structures and systems that support and give shape to culture. In Indian astrology, Saturn is understood to be the lord of form, of rupa. Saturn gives form to things, form to the individual body, but then also form to a society. So we have this this indicator, if you would, of form and shape. And then we have Pluto, and we've mentioned now Pluto has this very fiery, volcanic, angry, somewhat destructive energy. And when these two combine, what we see time and again over the decades and centuries, then we have a new order that comes about. And I don't mean that in an ominous way. This is a simple reality that every few decades, in fact, if we look at this cycle, the Saturn-Pluto cycle, this is about every 33 to 38 years or so. And it varies because of the very elliptic orbit of Pluto. But during these times, there are major there's a major restructuring of society, and of course at times it is more intense than at others. Specifically then, again, if we bring 2020 into the discussion, a year when Jupiter Jupiter is the energy of growth. Okay, so you can think of Jupiter and Saturn working together. That Saturn gives the structure, but Jupiter keeps it in place, you could say. So now if Jupiter is not there to give its buoyancy, Jupiter gives this expansive energy of growth. So there's no growth, and there's nothing keeping the structure up. And then at the same time, we've got Pluto, which you can describe in some ways as something of a wrecking ball. So this wrecking ball is coming in and it's hitting this structure. Then certainly these structures will be experiencing stress, to say the least, and they will crumble to some degree. And we can see that clearly playing out in the last few months. The world has changed and will keep changing, possibly for the rest of the year, as this conjunction plays out. Now, just to give you a sense of how this Jupiter-Saturn, Saturn-Pluto conjunction, how it has played out in the past, we can take a look at history, and then specifically the signs in which this conjunction happened. So as we've mentioned, this current conjunction is taking place in the sign of power, of authority, and it's no surprise that that police brutality then has also come up to some extent this year, and themes along these lines will probably continue, because we're dealing here with the sign of Capricorn, and perhaps later, if we have time, we can explore this sign in a bit more depth, because it truly is fascinating. The different levels of symbology connected to them. But if we move backwards in time, the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction was in November 1982. And again, in that year, we had a brief, but nonetheless a memorable recession, the so-called Reagan recession in the United States. And this conjunction happened in a very favorable sign. Okay, so this happened in the sign of Libra, and it ushered in many ways a new economic order. Libra is very much the sign of commerce, so much so that I have heard that Facebook is considering launching not only its own digital currency, but then also naming it Libra. So it is definitely a very long-standing tradition of an association between Libra, the scales, and trade. And if one looks at how world trade blossomed during that period, how institutions were set up, then it's clear that something of a new economic world order was enshrined during that transit. Of course, there were also uncertainties. There was also the fear of extinction. Okay, so this is very much this, and we have all felt this, I'm sure, over the last few months. This very deep sense of dread. And those of us listening who are old enough to remember the early 80s will recall that there was a similar feeling of unease in the air, a lot of social unrest, but also the very real danger of nuclear war, nuclear extinction, perhaps even. There was a policy between the Soviet Union and the United States of mutually assured destruction. The idea that if one of the two would launch a nuclear weapon, then the other would completely empty its arsenal on its enemy, and in other words, completely, there would be mutually assured destruction. So that's a really dreadful idea, and a very troubling concept to have around, and to a very troubling period to live through. And of course, that was reflected in media and popular culture. You couldn't really get away from that. And also, 1982 was also the year that the term AIDS was used for the first time to describe that pandemic. And again, it was a pandemic that in some ways changed the world and changed culture, the way that we interact with one another. If we go back even further, then we see that there was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in August of 1947. So that was after the Second World War, and for that matter, the First World War, that whole period, and the beginning of the Cold War, in fact. And this conjunction happened in the sign of Leo. So Leo, again, not as you would say, as heavy as the signs of Saturn. It said that Leo is ruled, of course, by the sun, and the sun is a sattvic planet, a sattva planet, a planet of illumination and light. But nonetheless, it is a sattva planet who hosted these two tamasic, these very heavy influences of Saturn and Pluto. And here again, we had a standoff, you know, between East and West, between the Soviet Union and the capitalist West in many ways. And this thing, you don't have to think very deeply about how a similar pattern is indeed developing right now again between the West and China. I think this is going to be a very significant part of the decades ahead, is the tension and negotiation of power between China and the West. But in terms of 1947, this was a time when there was a lot of ego flexing between these two superpowers. It gave us the space race, which I guess wasn't too bad as a payoff in terms of the competition between East and West. But nonetheless, yeah, a new order was established. It was also the year 1947 of the establishment of the International Monetary Fund, and it is fascinating to look at the history of banking and financial institutions, especially in light of these particular conjunctions. Then, if we go back a little further, and I think this is as far back as we'll go, because I think this will then further just illustrate the power of this conjunction. We find that in 1914, between 1914, October 1914, up until May 1915, we actually experienced 3 of these conjunctions. Okay, so it was, and this happens because of the seemingly retrograde motion that Saturn and all of the non-luminaries engage in. I just want to perhaps ask if we could. There's a bit of background. It seems to have solved itself. Great. So yeah, to return to 1914, I think that date immediately rings a bell in the mind, since that was, of course, the year that the First World War erupted. But of course, keep in mind here we had a triple conjunction. Okay, so triple conjunctions is this is really, yeah, like an intensification of this theme. And then it's perhaps then not surprising that we had a world war, and not long after that, and in many ways because of that First World War, we had a Second World War. And it is interesting, and yeah, we don't we don't want to scare anyone, but we have another triple conjunction scheduled for 2053, between 2053 and 2054. So that's the next Saturn Pluto conjunction. And thankfully, it will happen in a Jupiter sign. Jupiter is, of course, the great benefic. And I think when I looked at that chart, it's also Jupiter is in better shape than he is this year. So yeah, there's no reason to expect the scale of devastation of 1914 and the subsequent years of the Great War and the Second World War. But nonetheless, yeah, that is this just kind of frames this idea that we do experience these cycles with certain themes to them, cycles of creation and destruction, bhutva bhutva praliyate, as the Bhagavad Gita puts it, that this is the nature of the material world, is this coming together of structures and the dissolving of structures. Okay, so I think this then gives us something of an idea of what we are experiencing now, in a seen from a bird's eye view. If we then zoom in further, then, and I guess that would be of interest to most of our listeners, and that would be then this perhaps this COVID-19 situation. Now, as I touched on earlier, we had almost exactly the same configuration in the year 514 with the Justinian plague, and that was a pandemic brought back from the east by Roman soldiers to Rome. And there is speculation, of course, it's a long time ago, and a hotly debated issue, that possibly this pandemic lent itself to the eventual collapse of the Roman Empire. Now, initially, when I was looking at the astrology of 2019-2020, it seems to just, I don't want to say scream out, or well, but it very clearly seems to indicate difficulties or complications for empires in the West. And this is because Saturn has a connection in Vedic astrology to the Western direction and Western empires. There's some very interesting symbolic connections to explore. One would be, and I don't want to head off too far off topic now, but in terms of Saturn's role in the monetary system, in fact, the ancient Romans had their treasury under the temple of Saturn, and the US treasury is based. The design of the building has a lot of similarities to that temple of Saturn, if you look at this configuration, you see that there will be, or it's likely that there will be trouble in the West. And it was striking then when we saw that Italy was hit so hard by this COVID-19 pandemic, and then the United States. And I think the full effect hasn't been felt yet in the States, and of course time will tell. But from an astrological perspective, so much so that when I initially looked at the astrology of 2020, I felt like, well, this is an empire in the West will fall. Now, with that, I don't want to, again, scare anyone, but just looking at the configuration, it does seem like certain Western entities will be going through a hard time this year, and some of that I think has already played out. And if we consider the current position of Saturn and Pluto, they are in fact both moving backwards right now. They're seemingly moving backwards from the perspective of Earth, and they're moving back towards the point where this COVID-19, the time and space when this pandemic broke out. So you kind of get the sense then that things will, for some time, intensify before they get better, and they will likely only get better when Saturn around mid-September and Pluto beginning October start moving forward again, away from that very sensitive point that triggered this whole pandemic. And that very sensitive point, just to make that clear, seems to have been the eclipse of December 26th. And again, you know, when it comes to the power of eclipses, they bring about very sudden change, and they whatever is playing out in the greater sky, so to speak, an eclipse beams down dramatically to Earth, you could say, or allows or indicates that this thing will now manifest. Or will be embodied, you know. So for it may just be an image in the sky, but it's the power of the eclipse that embodies it. And this is thing, a motif that goes back a very long way, and you can find it in different cultures, that an eclipse can actually be utilized then in different spiritual practices, in different kinds of sadhanas, to materialize, to manifest a kind of change or a kind of shift. But yes, to return to our current state of affairs, we can expect some difficulties in the Western parts of the world as this astrological year continues, and as these planets responsible for these massive upheavals are intensifying their effect, or doubling down, you could almost say. So we're not out of the woods quite yet, but at the same time there is a lot of hope, I have to say, and that is coming from the fact that of all, looking at that astrological chart of 2020, we have Venus doing really well. Okay, so Venus, at least the heart, showing that the energy of relationship is potentially something that can soothe many of the challenges we will be facing. Venus is also the symbol of the nurse, or the medical professional, and of course they have been sacrificing a lot of their time and energy. From here, I would just perhaps touch on another very important and epoch-making conjunction, and this one is much more fantastic, one could almost say, in many ways. And this is the Grand conjunction. Again, this is a conjunction that has been studied for many centuries, and there's a lot to read on this topic. Shakespeare makes reference to this conjunction. Dante makes reference to it. It was very well known and well studied in the medieval world. And of course, a lot of superstition woven into some of these interpretations, but there are certain themes that seem to hold true. And the idea here is that Jupiter and Saturn, meet round about every 20 years. Okay, so as we've mentioned a bit earlier, these two are, they work together. We've got Jupiter giving growth or the power of expansion, and then that expansion is reinforced, you could almost say, by Saturn. And the two will now meet for the first time in almost 2 centuries, or thereabouts, in an air sign. Okay, so in contrast to their meeting in an earth sign. Okay, they did meet in an air sign briefly in the 80s, but if you draw up a timeline, you can see that there are these periods of around 240 years or so when they meet in a sign connected to one particular element. So roundabout for the last 240 years or so, we're looking at the beginning to mid 1800s when the current cycle started, and we've found ourselves in an earth cycle. Okay, so these two then create a culture that is very that very much reflects the element of the sign that they meet in. Okay, so they've been meeting in earth signs for about 220, 240 years. So and we have of course seen an incredible proliferation of materialism and material science in the last 240 or so years. We've seen land grabs all over the world, colonialism, wars fought about resources, oil, I said it, but this theme will likely now shift since we're dealing with the air element. And I think, and of course, you know, every sign has 2 sides, but they are meeting in the sign of Aquarius. So this truly is yeah, at the risk of invoking a perhaps outlived image, but this truly is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, of sorts, a mini age of Aquarius, with everything that goes with it. And one thing that is associated with the sign of Aquarius is a more lateral form of government. Okay, so not so top heavy as we've seen with Capricorn, and this is of course where Saturn and Jupiter recently met, but now a much more democratic, if you would, a system, a culture of more equality, of more openness. But added to that, at the same time, a more surveillance, because the power is moving, you could say, from being material, from being very gross, bullets, bombs, walls, is now moving towards air, and that is airspace. But also information. Information relates to the air element. And of course, we have been seeing a shift like that over the last few decades. That I think is very clear. But the wars of the future, and hopefully they won't heat up, but they may be cooler in the sense of being more, at least based on information, that information and cyber warfare will be more prominent. That doesn't mean that they will be less destructive, because there are of course very destructive things that you can do these days through cyber attacks. We saw that amidst this COVID epidemic, hospitals have been the victims of cyber attacks in certain countries, and that of course is very unfortunate, but it shows the power of this means of warfare, and also the power of surveillance, which will likely also intensify its grip on us. And we can also then expect certain shifts in culture. There is a very transgressive quality to Aquarius. Aquarius is a sign of the iconoclast, of challenging tradition. So we can expect that many traditional institutions, traditional values won't necessarily be erased, but they will be relativized. And of course, that has already started happening. And you can almost see that as an anticipation of this shift to the air element. As I mentioned it, we already had a taste of that in the 80s. This is when one of the first conjunctions in an air sign, and in that case Libra, happened. And in the 80s already we can recognize many of these themes. So for better or for worse, I don't know how you what you're feeling about the 80s is, but there's more of the 80s coming, you know. It's the 80s is making a comeback, and we've already experienced that on some levels in terms of music, culture, and fashion over the last few years. Tied into the air element is, of course, and also since it's a rising element, outer space exploration, and space projects. And of course, that has also been on the agenda of different world governments for many centuries. It was those who, the countries who had first standing armies and then later naval power that ruled the world. And of late, that a single country has been the United States, with an incredibly powerful navy that in one sense is policing the waters of the world and securing this system of international trade that was birthed in the beginning of the 80s. So now this arena of control, if you would, is shifting to space. It will be no longer who has power over the waters of the world, but the nation who has space power. And of course, that invokes Space Force, which shouldn't at all be a surprise, since this is definitely the direction in which we're moving. And it will likely also then see the beginning of mining colonies, perhaps on asteroids or on the moon, but capitalism extending itself into outer space, at least gradually. If we can at least not wipe ourselves out on the surface, then space truly is the next frontier for this next 240 years or so. Yeah, you know, there's definitely a lot more to say, a lot more to explore, but I do want to ask if there are any questions or if there's any comments related to these topics, any observations from those listening, because yeah, that could be really valuable.
Prabhu, if I could ask something. Firstly, thank you very much for the talk. It's been really great so far.
Thank you, Axl.
I was just wondering, you were mentioning that in the years to come, we can see perhaps a cooling down of conflicts, in the sense that they're more information-based and not as violent. But at the same time, at this moment, we're also seeing a rise in like this violent dictatorship style of rule that's returning. So how does that factor in? Is that just part of the transition still to the next period, or how exactly does that work?
I would like to think that, because it's what we see is that especially 2020 has, we have Mars here in Capricorn. Okay, so this is so Mars, of course, the warrior of the zodiac, the symbol of power, of force, and it's also here in the sign of Capricorn, and functioning optimally. So this is the contrast of this year. We've got the planet of mercy, of wisdom, of understanding, Jupiter, debilitated in Capricorn, and then we've got the Graha, the planet of conflict, of war, exalted, of violence, exalted in the sign of Capricorn. So yeah, definitely an imbalance that we're experiencing right now. To some extent, I'm very confident that this kind of top-heavy Capricorn system that you've just alluded to is definitely about to change. There's definitely a shift happening, and that is a shift towards Aquarius. It's very interesting that the big players in the world today are in most cases, they're old men. Okay, so we see that the president of China, for example, another autocrat, pretty much, is an old man, and he's part of this very much a Capricorn system. This very top-heavy system, and we have, of course, President of the United States, and even a contender, Joe Biden, also being somewhat aged, and in Europe, Germany has a rather aged Miss Merkel at the head of state. So these old leaders it's almost like their days are over. Okay, the climate that is coming will no longer, won't be able to tolerate that for much longer. And what is very interesting, I recently started looking at the chart of the Chinese Communist Party, and this conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter will take place in the sign of Aquarius, and Aquarius is a very important sign for the Chinese Communist Party. This is where their moon is placed, so indicating the people, the masses, and it's also where the ascendant is placed. So this shift is going to be felt, and if it's going to be felt by a big player like China, then the world will feel it in a similar fashion. What's happening in the United States, and yeah, looking at the astrology and how volatile this year really is. And I think it's almost regrettable that they don't have astrological think tanks to take advice from, because this is not the year where you want to start a fire. If there's one year that you don't want to start a fire, or you don't want to start agitating and escalating dissatisfaction, especially the masses, then it is 2020. So yeah, that could hopefully usher in I'm hesitant to say something better because it rarely is something better, but it's something different, and I also don't want to claim that it will be something better. It will be something different. We all know that the more things change, the more they stay the same, but a different flavor. I did see a brief comment come up here about feminism, and that that's a very interesting topic. During this period, I have found it striking that the countries with female leadership they seem to handle this thing better, you know, and this, at least this COVID-19 crisis. And it is striking that the sign opposite to Capricorn is, of course, the sign of Cancer. Cancer is ruled by the moon, so it has this feminine archetype connected to it. So what we understand, whenever there's trouble in one sign, as there is right now in Capricorn, then the cure is usually to be found in the sign opposite to it. So I think that's actually a very big part of the solution to many of the problems we're facing right now. Of course, things will change now as we move into this little age of Aquarius. But when it comes to the time we're in now, then there are very important features of the female archetype that we definitely need right now. So yeah, Axl, I don't know if that really answers your question. I hope so.
Answered my question very well, Prabhu. It was greatly informative. Thank you very much.
I've seen a few other questions came through. One asked one question about this COVID-19 thing or pandemic. I mean, I say thing because there are so many narratives out there right now that it's difficult to pin it down. But there's an additional feature of 2020 that we didn't even discuss, and that is the so-called Kala Sarpa Yoga. And this is a very interesting feature that that allows for fear-mongering. That would be the best way to phrase it in contemporary terms. In ancient texts speak of it as a kind of possession. But if you look at how it's formed astrologically, it's not necessarily a possession by evil spirits. It's more evil memes, you could say. And meme here now is in many ways a feature of this information society we're moving in, and especially related to the air element, like this kind of ideas, like an information conceptual packages. It's almost like we have a war of the memes going on. So however real the COVID crisis is as an actual virus pandemic, it also has its meme, its information leverage component to it. So the good news is that will, or at least this Kala Sarpa Yoga, that's kind of aggravating this meme energy of this war of the memes, or being susceptible, the masses being susceptible to these memes. We've seen all sorts of well, some may describe them as conspiracy theories. It all depends on where you stand. But this susceptibility will thankfully be easing in the next month or so. And then looking at the astrology that triggered this whole crisis, or this pandemic, that will be easing towards September, October, when Pluto then starts moving forward away from that that point of instigation. Now, you know, at the same time, the reality is, if you go and read up about the Justinian plague of 540 or so, that plague was around for hundreds of years. They just couldn't get rid of it. Now, of course, in the medical and preventative measures have advanced over the centuries to some extent. So hopefully we won't see a repeat of that. But I think the meme power of this COVID crisis will thankfully subside to some degree towards the end of the year. I also saw a question about spirituality and this shift, and does this shift is it favorable for this the spread of spirituality? Well, it's a mixed bag. There is definitely, let's think of it like this: there is a change. Spirituality will have to change in this coming era. That when it comes to top-heavy spiritual hierarchies, that's going to be very, very difficult to maintain that. There's definitely going to be a renegotiation of the power dynamic when it comes to spirituality. We can expect a much more individualized form of spirituality taking root, and also much more eclectic. You see, Aquarius is the sign of eclecticism, so collecting different ideas and almost like the collage. And yeah, that is going to have a mixed effect. On one hand, the power of tradition is incredibly powerful for authentic and transformative spiritual practice. That is undeniable. At the same time, the proliferation of ideas and the accessibility of spiritual teachers and spiritual teachings will make it, I think, increasingly difficult to not branch out, you could say, to not kind of pick and choose, and that of course can be very unhealthy, seen from a certain perspective, but it may also bring a lot of innovation to traditions as well, like reinventing certain techniques and ways that certain philosophies have thought about themselves and spiritual advancement. Just want to check if there are any other questions here. Of course, if anyone feels inspired, please
Can I ask?
Yes.
Something, Kavi?
Please. Yes, I can hear you.
What I want to know is if you
unfortunately, there seems to be a very yeah, the connection doesn't seem so good.
25th. Something.
Would you perhaps be able to type your question, or if someone else can hear it, if they can type it, because yeah, it seems to I can't hear the audio there.
Is he unmuted? Perhaps while he types out his question, I have a question. I kind of just want to focus a bit more on perhaps like the positive side, or what we can take from this epidemic. So I know we just spoke about the spiritual side, and perhaps that hierarchies will change, perhaps, you know, it'll become more feminine, allowing, can we say? And you also mentioned that relationships will become a bit stronger. So is there any other type of positive change that we will be experiencing perhaps during this time?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that. Yes, well, this is a great opportunity to cultivate gratitude and compassion. Okay, now I hope this doesn't come across as too hackneyed or almost watered down new age, but this is because of the position of Jupiter this year. because Jupiter is kind of like in a reset mode. So if one can start cultivating gratitude now, it will grow exponentially throughout this coming Jupiter cycle. This is a great year for that, a great year for cultivating gratitude, because it's so much, it's way more difficult to have genuine gratitude if you lose your house, if you lose your job, if things stop functioning around you, because then you really have to dig. You have to really get to the essence of things. What is it that I'm really grateful for? What is it that no one can take away from me? That my job can't take away from me, that the government can't take away from me, that the virus can't take away from me. So this true possibility for vitarka, for inquiry, who am I? That is something that I wish we could broadcast everywhere. That this is the year, that you can really ask yourself this question.
Oh, thank you so much for that answer. It was quite nice. I love the whole compassionate theme and gratitude.
Yeah, well, there will be many opportunities to practice compassion, looking at the state of the world now.
It felt like.
Oh yes.
Oh no, it just felt like you were kind of asking us all to become Viktor Frankl.
Wow. Yes. Yeah. No, I guess I was. I was. Yeah. But that is his whole way of looking at the world. Even his therapy, logotherapy, is very much in line with this year. Finding meaning this beyond all these material structures that are proving themselves to be ultimately fictional, flimsy and fictional. They're not really real. They're ultimately seen from the perspective of eternity. They're shadows against the wall. So what is the light? That's a very important question to really ask. What is the light? What is consciousness?
Well, from that perspective, it actually seems that this COVID-19 is actually a blessing.
Yes, I mean, of course, it's difficult or almost dangerous to say that, or controversial if you go around saying that. But definitely, it can be seen, and it should be seen like a blessing.
Cool. Thank you so much, Prabhu, for your answer. Perhaps we could just give a few more seconds if Robert wants to type his question,
yes.
Or if anyone else has a question.
Okay, Kavi, I'll try. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Okay, I'm sorry. What I want to know is, just for interesting sake, if you set a scenario or configuration of the stars or whatever get together, and you get a bunch of astrologers together, will they necessarily all come to the same conclusion or not?
I think that they will come to similar conclusions. It will depend a lot on their experience and how many case studies they have done. You'll have to rank their opinion according to what kind of experience they have. But even Eastern and Western astrologers will, I think, for the most part, agree with what I've presented today. I didn't really go to touch. I didn't touch on any kind of controversial or contested areas. This is very run-of-the-mill, almost beginner textbook astrology. If you most of what I mentioned, if you start reading through an introductory textbook on astrology, they will describe Pluto the way that we've been describing Pluto and Saturn and Aquarius and so forth. So yeah, this is very run-of-the-mill kind of astrology. But yeah, things can get very interesting if you have someone who has studied a specific technique or is a specialist in political astrology.
Okay, one more question, then I'm done. Is
Definitely.
astrology as it is, was it more relevant in the past, in like in ancient times, than in like today? It seems to me astrology, well, because I don't know anything, nothing about this, but I'm just asking, is it really relevant in modern times with modern science? Is it really still relevant?
Well, yeah, that of course, there's a certain section of the scientific community that will be outraged just by the fact that we're having this discussion this evening. You know, they would see it as something terribly primitive, like a lapse into primitive thinking, and you know, it's degenerative, anti-scientific, anti-humanist, and and the like. But to some degree, they may be right. There are definitely certain aspects of astrology that have been taken out of context and have not been well understood. But I see in the new generation of astrologers that there is a more, you could say, almost like a balanced perspective of astrology, that they're incorporating scientific ideas with some of these ancient ideas. I think the value of contemporary astrology is in its archetypal analysis, and that's what I've been trying to do this evening. Is we've been looking at archetypes, and that we can. I think we've got a reasonably solid tradition of archetypal analysis and archetypal astrology. Or certain conventions, you could say, like a language of reading the skies, that we can that we can use to understand the major themes that are playing out. Of course, if you are revolted by the idea, then simply don't look into it. As simple as that. But I feel, I mean, unfortunately, there's been so little research, especially statistical research, when it comes to these major world-shaping events, like, for example, banking history. There's no systematic astrological statistical study on the history of banking. That could be fascinating, and because there is so much documented market statistics, you know, so that could be a fascinating study for someone to undertake. When it comes to studying pandemics, again, there's no textbook on the topic, although it's not difficult to see that there is a correlation between these archetypes and pandemics. So yeah, you can, like another case in point, we didn't even touch on this. We've been speaking about the Saturn Pluto conjunction. 1914 also hosted the Spanish flu, a major pandemic that again had led to millions of deaths. So it's I think there's a lot of work to be done, and when the scientific community can perhaps become more open-minded about astrology and you know, just give it a bit of space, at least look into it from a scientific perspective, then that can in fact lead to a very interesting hybrid science, I think. And fortunately, the sign of astrology is very favorable to this kind of integration of the scientific and traditional thought. So we may yet see something like that in the coming years. Of course, I'm hoping for that. Great.
Thanks, Kavi.
Thank you. Thank you for the
Hi, everybody. Hi, Jacobus. Nice to meet you. Hi. I really appreciate and enjoy when someone takes the effort to sort of piece together whatever tool they're using to show us a picture of the development of human consciousness over time, because there's always some sort of pattern, or, you know, everything has a pattern. Even the way the planets move is in a pattern.
Yeah.
It's not random. It's got a form. It's got a picture. It's a flower or it's a spiral. There's nothing that's completely random. It's quite an organized system, and it has cycles. And if we look at it deeply and we trace back into our development and how it shaped the development of our consciousness as it is today, I mean, the patterns reoccur to some degree, maybe with more depth or more levity, but our consciousness meets it at a different level. So we will not necessarily repeat the same outcome because of the way that we meet whatever is taking shape in our solar system, which of course is part of a bigger galaxy and a bigger system. It's a very vast, I mean, it's so vast. So this is just one slice, one window we're looking through to give us some insight into how we can understand ourselves as human beings within the working of something much, much bigger. And something interesting I wanted to share with you, I'm not an astrologer, so I know the moon affects the planet. I mean, because I'm a skipper, and I will not take my boat out when the tide is high. So if it's full moon, you look at how the water is affected just simply by the moon. So definitely the planets do have an impact and a biomagnetic or electromagnetic impact on the Earth, because we're all magnets. Essentially, the human body is a magnet too. So how we are affecting each other is very interesting. But anyway, so back to, so you can make a study on many different levels, even medically, you know, if you're interested enough in it. So, and then to piece it all together. And I think that's where we're coming to now, is that all these experts in their fields, if they could come together and share their knowledge in a meaningful way and have a conversation and govern together, instead of wanting to be an expert and an advisor on the external level, but rather bring out the expertise in everyone so that there's a communal voice and a communal decision making, we will meet this with more development. So everything has to evolve, including spirituality and how we apply it. So that was the one insight I kind of gathered from what you're sharing. And the other was my daughter and I, we've been doing a homeschool program. And we just studied the 7 days of creation, just very basic Western, with a Western way of looking at it, because there are many ways of looking at it. And so we were doing the first day, we drew the picture, God created the light. So we were drawing the light. And then we carried on, and on the 4th day, God created the sun and the moon. And Mira asked me, she's 9, she asked me, so what light did he create on the first day? Because he only created the sun on the 4th day. And I actually couldn't give her an answer there and then. So I was like, okay, well, what is light? And what did God create on the first day? What light? And as we sort of talked this through and through the pictures and drawing the light, we came to a few insights. And the one was, well, obviously, God came from somewhere, because here was chaos, disorder. So there was already some sort of element here. We can call that the Ahrimanic, very dense material, as we understand from the Persian writings. So there was something here. It was here, but it was chaotic. So from somewhere, an entity came and brought light and order. And then as it progressed, some vessels and containers for the light. So perhaps the sun and the moon became containers, not the actual light, but just a container for it. And as each human being was created, they became a container. And the seed of that light was implanted in every person. And as we now move through our sort of evolution, now in, say, we're going towards 3,000 years after Christ, what is happening now between the forces of the material, the forces of the light, and the forces of the spiritual world? which we are all playing a role in. And how are we going to be carriers of that light without it becoming lost in the chaos and that unformed, which is actually essentially a completely foreign element to the light. And that's why they would be almost constantly at war with each other inside, because they're foreign to each other. They're foreign. And they have to come and talk with each other. So Mira kind of helped me understand that God, as we understood it in the Western story, it didn't have to create light because it already existed and was just brought here. And we could look at it scientifically and say light is just photons, and you know, that was already in the universe and all this, but this doesn't quite satisfy the human being, I think, on all levels, the scientific explanation either. It's a little bit, it's lacking somehow. So, but it is a piece. So there's a lot of pieces, and the more we can understand about the whole picture, how we fit into all of it, and what we can do with all of it now, I think the more meaning we can add. Because there's no meaning given as, I think, a predetermined meaning, but there are predetermined cycles, because they will happen naturally. And now we have to add meaning to that.
Indeed. Yeah, well, it's definitely an endlessly interesting topic. Thank you for mentioning that creation sequence, because yeah, there's definitely a lot of depth in that. Well,
yeah, I haven't figured it all out yet, but
yeah, well, that is part of the adventure of being alive. But I do feel, Tara, are we basically out of time here?
Yeah, I think if there's no more questions or anything, then we can wrap it up. I have seen a few people have left already, so perhaps they have studies or something.
Oh, of course, there's a lot to do. As we just heard, you know, we have to balance, and this is true. This is very true. That would in itself be a very interesting topic for a future session. But yeah, thank you for this opportunity, Tara, and I wish you and everyone listening all the best for what's left of 2020. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us, Kavi-karnapura. So I just posted your website in the chat for anyone who would like to check it out. Kavi also does give readings, and also like relationship readings, personal readings. I'm not sure what other ones, but you can check it out there. And his bio is there. It's very extensive, but very wonderful. So you guys can check that out. But yeah, just thank you so much for joining us, Kavi-karnapura. We really appreciate it. I learned so much from you. My mom even commented that, you know, you're just so knowledgeable. You just know so much. She was like, "How do you know so much?"
No. I have many teachers. Yes. Okay, well, thank you again, and good evening.
Thank you. Cool. Good evening.
thank you.
Hare Krishna. Jai.
Thank you very much, Kavi.
Stop.
Thank you, Kavi-karnapura.